You're standing in St. Mark's Square in Venice. The sky is a perfect Italian blue. The basilica rises behind you, its golden mosaics catching the sun. You have a paper bag of breadcrumbs in one hand. You toss a handful into the air.
Pigeons, that iconic image of a tourist in St. Mark's Square, arms outstretched and covered in a flurry of feathered friends, is totally illegal. Breaking this law can land you a fine of up to 500 euros. While some reports mention even higher dollar amounts, the official penalty is a steep one. So, why is Venice so incredibly strict about this? It really boils.
A pigeon lands on your shoulder, then another on your wrist. Then a dozen more swirl around your head, settling on your arms, your hat, your camera bag. Your friend takes a picture. You laugh. It is one of those classic European tourist moments. Every guidebook has talked about it for 100 years. A municipal officer in a dark uniform walks over. He hands you a fine for 500 euros. We've always been told that feeding pigeons is the kind of harmless, slightly old-fashioned activity grandparents do in city squares. A bag of crumbs, a bench, a few birds. What could possibly be wrong with that? In Venice, almost everything. The fine for feeding a pigeon in Venice is among the highest of any tourist offense in the European Union. It is enforced. People pay it. And the law that created it was passed only after the city realized that one of its most famous tourist activities was, in a literal physical sense, eating the city alive. This is the story of how one of the most photographed places on Earth went from worshipping its pigeons to tolerating them to declaring them a public enemy. Why a 500 euro fine became necessary, and what it tells us about the math of over-tourism in a city built on water. Let's begin. You need to understand the history first because it is genuinely strange. For most of Venice's existence, pigeons were not pests. They were sacred. There are several origin stories, but the most enduring involves Palm Sunday at the Basilica of San Marco. According to tradition, pigeons were released from the gallery of the church with paper tied to their feet. The paper made them too heavy to fly far. They would flutter down into the square below, where citizens caught them and ate them. Some pigeons survived. Those survivors were considered to have earned the protection of St. Mark himself. They were left alone. They roosted in the church domes. They bred. Their descendants spread. For centuries afterward, harming a pigeon in Venice was a crime. First-time offenders were fined. Repeat offenders went to prison. Wealthy citizens left money in their wills for the care and feeding of the birds. Local guidebooks from the 1800s describe the pigeons as part of the city's spiritual landscape. This is the part where the story turns. By the late 20th century, Venice had a problem. The population of resident humans had collapsed from around 175,000 in the 1950s to roughly 50,000 today. But the population of tourists had exploded. The city now receives more than 50 million visitors a year. That is roughly 1,000 tourists for every full-time resident. Each one of those tourists, for decades, was a potential pigeon feeder. The city had licensed corn vendors. People could buy a small paper cone of grain for a few coins, scatter it in the square, and become the center of a feathered cyclone for a beautiful Instagram moment. Many did. The pigeon population responded the way any animal population responds to an unlimited food supply. It exploded. At its peak, the pigeon population in St. Mark's Square alone is estimated to have reached around 40,000 birds. The total population across central Venice was certainly higher. The city had become, by accident, one of the most pigeon-dense urban environments in Europe. This is basically like running a permanent, free, all-you-can-eat buffet for an animal that breeds rapidly and produces extremely corrosive waste. Here is where the math gets ugly. A single pigeon produces about 25 pounds of droppings per year. Multiply that by 40,000 birds in one square, then add the rest of the city. Then consider that pigeon droppings are highly acidic. They contain uric acid. They eat into limestone, marble, and bronze. They are chemically a slow but relentless attack on exactly the materials Venice is made of. The basilica's facade, the marble columns of the Doge's palace, the bronze lions that decorate the city's monuments, the carved stone window frames on every historic palazzo. All of it was being slowly dissolved by an organism the city had spent 8 centuries protecting. The pigeons were also pecking at the buildings directly. They were searching for grain that had blown into crevices and CMs. Each peck removed a tiny bit of stone. Multiplied across 40,000 birds and 1,000 years of architecture, the damage was visible. If you want to keep getting these stories about how everyday tourist activities collide with reality, hit subscribe. We post a new investigation every Wednesday at 4 p.m. The cost of cleaning was its own crisis. Venice deployed a special cleaning machine in St. Mark's Square every night during high season, scrubbing the pavement clean of overnight droppings. Building owners hoped for rain to help wash their facades. Restoration crews worked constantly to reverse the corrosion on monuments. One study estimated that the total cost of pigeon-related cleanup and damage worked out to roughly 275 to 350 euros per Venetian resident per year paid through taxes. The number has likely gone up since then. The math eventually became impossible to ignore. Each romantic photo of a tourist with pigeons on their head was, in real terms, a tiny but measurable contribution to the slow destruction of one of the world's most fragile cities. So in 2008, Venice acted. The city banned the feeding of pigeons throughout its entire historic center. The licensed corn vendors, some of whom had been operating for nearly a century, were forced out of business. Initial fines were set at around 50 euros, then raised again. Today, fines for feeding pigeons in Venice can reach 500 euros, with serious or repeat violations triggering the upper end. The same penalty structure now applies to feeding seagulls. Inspectors patrol the square. They watch for tourists scattering crumbs. They issue fines on the spot. There is no warning. There is no debate. You feed a pigeon, you pay. The bird population responded, slowly. The numbers in St. Mark's Square dropped significantly over the following years, as the artificial food supply disappeared and the population reverted to something closer to what the local environment could naturally support. The damage to the buildings continues, but at a slower pace. Now, the deeper point. Venice is not just regulating birds. It is regulating tourists. The 500 euro pigeon fine sits inside a much larger architecture of rules that have appeared in the city over the last 20 years. There are fines for swimming in the canals, fines for sitting on monument steps, fines for walking around topless or in swimwear, fines for camping in public spaces, fines for cycling, a day tripper access fee for tourists who visit without staying overnight. Each rule exists because the city has done the math, and the math comes back the same way every time. With 50 million visitors a year and 50,000 residents, even small percentages of misbehavior create massive cumulative damage. 1% of 50 million is 500,000 people. If 500,000 people each toss a handful of crumbs, the result is hundreds of thousands of pounds of unnatural food being injected into a tiny urban ecosystem every year. There is no version of that situation that is sustainable. Venice is the leading edge of a problem that is now appearing in dozens of cities around the world. Barcelona, Amsterdam, Kyoto, Dubrovnik, Prague. Each one is wrestling with the same question. How do you preserve a place that millions of people want to visit when each visit, individually, leaves a small but real mark? The 500 euro fine is one answer. It is not the only answer, but it is a clear public statement of a fact that took the city a long time to admit, that beautiful traditions can become destructive at scale, and that protecting a place sometimes means making the things that brought tourists there in the first place officially off limits. The next time you travel somewhere famous, look around at the rules. Notice which behaviors are explicitly forbidden. Each one of those rules was almost certainly written in response to something a visitor was doing, without thinking, multiplied by every other visitor doing the same thing on the same day. The pigeon fine is not arbitrary. It is the price of saving a city. If this story changed how you think about being a tourist, share this video with someone who is planning a trip to Italy this summer. They might want to know the rules before they reach for a bag of crumbs. Stay curious. We'll see you Wednesday.